Right, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to our Crusade series. And today I'm joined by a very special guest, and that is Apostolic Majesty himself. How are you, sir?
Hello, AI. I've been corrected finally on how to properly refer to you after all of these years. Happy to be here and happy to learn something.
No, no worries. And maybe a bit of irony in this is the up on the screen here, AM, is the official title of the Teutonic Knights, which supposedly, according to William Urban, the actual term Teutonic was a bit of a derogatory term by English and French crusaders as a sort of a way to say that these knights were drunkards and unserious warriors and friars. So and the name sort of stuck. So, but don't worry because this channel's been going probably about 6 years now, and yeah, it's an unfortunate issue with the fonts that go on with social media and on here. But no, that's gonna. Uh, so thank you for not dead naming myself. So um, today's stream, we're going to be covering the Prussian Crusade, which, of course, is part of the wider Northern Crusades, probably one of the most important parts of Northern Crusades. And so, just to remind people in chat and also with AM, we've covered the beginnings of a Northern Crusade against the pagans in the Baltic, and we started that with our second Crusade stream, particularly against the Wends, and to a lesser extent against the Pomeranians as well. These, of course, being not the Indo-European Baltic peoples of the Prussians and the uh, uh, Livs and the Lithuanians. These were against Slavic pagans, similar that to uh, Poland and the Czech people. And this occurred during the Second Crusade, round about 1147-48, and as a result, it was seen as by many in the church, particularly many in the Archbishopry of Magdeburg and Bremen, as a secular ploy to land grab and not give the church its dues, and also attacking Christians in the settlement of Stettin, where missionary work had already begun. And so widely, it was sort of condemned, particularly by Duke Henry, the Lion of Saxony, who again was seen as um, a ploy to just grab land. It is worth noting with the Wends, this particular part, which makes up parts of northern Germany and northern Poland today, was a largely um, sparsely populated region, rather swamp area, but it did begin the trend of German um, migration eastwards into the sparsely populated regions which had small Western Slavic tribes. And this began with the Wendish Crusade, and beyond this, we also see the rise of cities like Lubeck as well, which is going to be playing a very important position in the ascendancy of the Teutonic Knights. Um, as you can see on screen here, the name of the order, the Teutonic Knights, which is synonymous with the Crusades, given their um, international stature and relationship with the Holy Roman Empire, and many of the electors within it, and kings and what have you. Um, of course, they are like most of the orders had a very humble and uh, rather simple origin story, and they began during the Third Crusade as an outpost for particular German knights who were traveling to um, Acre, and as a result of the um, mix of plague and uh, various forms of exhaustion that goes on within armies, there was a great need of many hospitals to form up to bring the knights and pilgrims back into shape. One of the problems that the reason why a German order was founded was solely because of the um, I guess you could say in the favor there's with the Hospitallers and Knights and Templars as well. There was a more favoritism towards their own national groups, that being the French and English and what have you. And so there was also, with as we mentioned in our previous episode, there was an element of hostility with the German contingent of the crusading force of the remnants of uh, um, Barbarossa's force, particularly from Richard. So the Germans had very few allies to speak of. So the origins of this was a handful of knights who, or handful of pilgrims, I should say, who were friars and also were also trained in medicine, and so they would just be like a pure medical field hospital near enough, which then would expand for and gain prominence, particularly for healing many German knights who would then report back um, the help and aid provided for them by this order, and it would spark, particularly with the German princes, dukes, and what have you, and the German population, this admiration for this order, particularly when they, like many other orders, swore the uh, chastity, poverty, and would stay in many of their forts, which would be granted to them by, I believe it was uh, Pope Urban or Pope Clement, but they would be granted forts and outpost positions around the Holy Land. And given that like the Hospitallers and the Templars, they would have to stay in these positions all year round, which is something many of the secular knights who weren't sworn to such uh, you know to poverty and chastity and what have you, would be able to do, including many of them who also may have held titles and fiefdoms back in Europe. And so yeah, this is the origin story of the Order of the Brothers of the House of the German House of Saint Mary in Jerusalem. I'll just go to the next slide. AM, did you want to interject with anything at all?
No, just to say that's it's all sort of very interesting that despite the you could say the losses in the Levant and the fact that the order is founded around the same time as the Third Crusade, that is able to establish, as we'll later see, such a marked foothold on what was then, as far as Christendom was concerned, the complete opposite end of the planet, effectively. But no, and we'll obviously talk about Hermann von Salza and how much of an intriguing figure he is.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and it's quite interesting because the first two Grand Masters, there's actually very little about them that I could find, even within temporary and contemporary German sources. The first is the first Grand Master, the founder is a Heinrich Walpole, who was there for 2 years. Then you had a Otto von Kerpen and a Heinrich Barth. Um, and while there's very little about them, what's quite interesting was in that time frame of because they all served roughly about 2 to a year each. So there was quite a quick succession, one after the other. They were able to establish themselves as not just a order for healing and for medicine, but also an order which could be martial, could arm themselves and defend, and also go on the offensive as well, and in various raids and what have you. And they'd be given forts in like near Ascalon, in Gaza, and across parts of southern Palestine as well. And it's also worth mentioning that there was as one can imagine, given them being a German order, there was an element of rivalry, particularly with the Hospitaller Knights, and onto Templars to a point. But I get the feeling, particularly from the um, sources, and particularly I think it was Peter, the chronicler written by a fellow called Peter, that it was quite crowded space. Palestine at the time for knightly orders, and particularly this going into the start of the 13th century, this was something that was a problem, and also as you mentioned, it's the other end of Christendom. I mean, it was beyond Christendom. It's the other end. Effectively, might as well be the other end of the world. And for logistics and travel wise, there for an upstart order, it's incredibly draining. They needed to have like constant flow of donations, which they could get, but it's also the return. And von Salsa, to a point, realized this, and of course he would be um, instrumental in planning of the and the execution of the Fifth Crusade in Egypt, and was captured um, with many of the others. And the knights at this point would be gaining experience, particularly in cavalry, and also in raiding as well. So during during this period of Hermann von Salza, he was able to befriend the Holstein Emperor, which was Frederick II, and was able to have this very strong relationship with both the Emperor and the Pope. And of course, this is during a period that, of course, there would be friction with both the emperor and the pope. And I know you streamed on this AM with the um, investiture crisis and what have you. But what's interesting is that Grandmaster Hermann von Salza was able to um, be this incredible diplomat, where he could befriend and have great relations with both. And a question of his loyalty, which would come up in some cases, he was able to reassure both sides that his loyalty was effectively to the church, and I think he defined it as loyalty to the church and obedience to the emperor, and that was how he was able to navigate that. Ultimately, though, his ultimate loyalty and devotion and time was to the order itself, and we see this with what we go on here. Um, so, uh, Am, did you have anything else you wanted?
No, just to say, obviously, as you know, following the Third Crusade, the Kingdom of Acre was established, but it was very much a limited success. And so there were many other frontiers on which the sort of borders of Christendom again were either threatened or felt the need to expand. And so one of the areas where the knights actually found themselves was in Hungary,
Yeah,
establishing areas in. There's a region in it's now Romania, but it used to be called in Transylvania. It used to be called Siebenbürgen, and it was heavily colonized by Transylvanian Saxons, Germans. You also find this elsewhere in the Baltic, where you have quote unquote Saxon colonies, and Saxon, kind of like Teuton, is one of these catch all terms that is used to describe anyone who is sort of even faintly German. But it sort of starts them off in this interesting relationship whereby they become ingratiated with a local ruler, overstep
Mm.
their position, and find themselves expelled. So what happens in Hungary is a tiny little sort of foretaste of what we're going to see with Knight's relationship with Poland.
Yes, and it's quite interesting because when he's in the court of Andrew II of Hungary, who invites him in, you know, uh, Herman is effectively given like uh, almost like a chancellor-esque position, like with negotiating the uh, um, marriage uh, with Princess Elizabeth to his son Prince Louis. There is this this high status within the in the Hungarian court, and his his defense of the border regions between the Peshmerga Cumans in what's nowadays modern day Moldova and Western Ukraine um, is it goes to show that the experience of particularly building forts where in quite wooded rough terrain um, and also dealing with uh, you know those sorts of raiding parties and of course this experiment which Herman and the order undertook was unfortunately, as you mentioned, it didn't work out, and they were expelled they were kicked out of Hungary, uh, probably due to well, obviously it was down to a disagreement with Andrew II, but also largely down to the power and influence that they were gaining within the country. And one thing that Herman was to he learned from this lesson was even when it came to his closest allies, even with the Holy Roman Emperor, um, if he wanted to the order, and in his mind, the order were always going to acquire land and space to govern. It had to be on effectively like creating a new state, a monastic state, which would be separate enough that they wouldn't be affected by interference or expulsion and removal of titles. And when it came to negotiations, and of course, the official story with the story that we, as you mentioned, is that Conrad, the Duke of Mazovia, who was experiencing raids by Prussians, particularly in the south, near uh, Chelm um, and in southern Prussia, the um, invitation went out, but in reality there was a quite a detailed back and forth with the Holy Roman Emperor, with the Pope, and also with the local magnates in Pomerania, um, uh, Svendopol, and the Duke of Mazovia about Teutonic Knights coming into the region. What rights would they have, and what could they? Are they going to be just developing forts to protect the borders of Christendom? How far are they going to get? So there was a multi-level negotiation that went on, and even scouting operations by the knights to determine the best way to go about this. And yeah, it's this was something which was very much pushed by the Messian Duke, Lubeck, and Bremen, the Archbishopry of Bremen, um, particularly for Lubeck, as they would go on to send merchants to Marienwerter and Kreuzberg, which would create these new trading hubs, which would cause the ire of Sventopol in Pomerania, who felt that the Teutonic Knights had gone over their original mission and were um, competing trade-wise in the region. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself with that point. So yeah, and just to swap it up a bit, the first action in the Baltic, just before the arrival of of Hermann and the Teutonic Order, was of course the um, missionary work that started in the late, so round about this time, the Siege of Acre, which was, or just a bit after, was in Livonia, or modern day Latvia, Estonia, and this was centered at Riga, and from there, this was the um, creation of a archbishopry where you would have um, missions supported by the Danish crown as well, of uh, uh, Vladimir II, Valdemir II, and who would then go on to capture northern Estonia for the crown of Denmark. But what you would have is you would have this. I'll just bring up the next slide here. Here you go, Livonian Crusade. You would have the Archbishopry of Riga. You'd have established, but due to levels of pagan attacks from the local Liv population and other surrounding pagan tribes, and even from Lithuania as well, uh, Bishop Albert, who was brought in he was a Saxon bishop, um, saw potential in the creation of a new monastic order in the Baltic, and formed up what would be known as the um, uh, Livonian Brothers of the Sword. And for those looking at our who have seen the thumbnail of this stream, there's two figures, uh, knights. The one on the left is a Teutonic knight, and on the one on the right is the Brothers of the Sword one. And going ahead, the Brothers of the Swords would be uh, dismantled, and then the remaining members would uh, join up as a chapter within the Teutonic Order. So the Livonian Order would just become part of the Teutonic state um, a few decades later. And yeah, the Bishop of Riga was able to lead uh, wars and conflict against the Livs, and I'll just bring up, just wait, bear with me here. I'll just bring up a passage here. So here we go. We got a quote here. So Livonia before 1200, where merchants from Gotland who wanted to eliminate pirate and robber bases, as well as forms of missionaries and that of orthodoxy, began small conflicts known as the Little War, and angry about recent raids by Estonia and the Kirch, the Cortlanders, freebooters on what is today southern Sweden. Merchant ships were attacked on the way to Novgorod through the Gulf of Finland. And this would instigate a direct response from the bishopry um, of Riga. Just to answer in chat, we haven't. I've just gone. I'm sort of trying to go in chronological order, talking briefly about the Livonian Crusade, Don't worry, I haven't skipped ahead yet. Um, so prior to the 1200s, before the Germans and Scandinavians in Livonia, Orthodox princes, they had a loose uh, uh, sort of vassalage system with over the pagan tribes, and particularly loose when it came to the lives on the coast, um, due to the um, proximity to the Russian territory. So the Kurds and uh, particularly the maritime Estonians as well, would fall easily under the prince's tribute um, and influence of orthodoxy, though no great undertaking from Russians of missionary work was taken in Estonia on an organized level. Though on an individual level there would be attempts, but nothing by the state or what we see in Western um, in the Western Church. So you had the Chud people living on the eastern shores of as well as on the Gulf of Finland, and that's where you would see this sort of pirate raiding, and the Danish particularly would take, and you can see in the map on the right there, the Danish control one, which would trigger the response. Um,
Do you mind if I ask you a question, AI? Because
yeah,
this
sure,
has
go ahead.
been this has been something that I've always pondered. Obviously, we're talking about the crusade against the Livonian was called by Innocent III. I think it was the end of the 12th century.
Yeah, that's right.
If you look at Russian history, the foundation of, you can say, Rus, quote unquote, sort of semi-Viking settlement goes back to the 9th century, and the
Hmm.
Christianization of Russia goes back to the early 11th century. So you
Yeah.
have this, what ultimately proves out to be a very important strategic territory, which is lodged right in the middle of, well, you can say, the spheres of influence of what would later be the German sort of maritime republics, the Republic of Novgorod, and the Kingdom of Sweden, and of course, by extension, the Kingdom of Denmark. And yet, it was relatively politically decentralized, and Christianization efforts have been, relatively feeble. I just wonder how this area could have essentially been in this state of, I'm not going to say anarchy, but relatively uncivilized and lacking political central control or influence from these other
Yeah.
states. When we look at the rest of the millennia taking place, and we see this not just as setting the stage for various wars, but we're talking about existential struggles like that of Sweden and Russia in the Great Northern War. So it's always been a question, that bothers me, why no one seemed to consider this an important strategic area when in all the following
Mm.
centuries it was considered of pivotal strategic significance.
It's quite interesting that there is the Czech prelate, Bishop of um, Olmütz, did actually address s- somewhat to that point you make, and his understanding with, and this was in reaction to the like many pagan uprisings in the Baltic, particularly in Livonia and Prussia, is effectively the topography of the terrain was these incredibly dense forests, and so there was like a natural form of cutoff. Now, with Russia, of course, with the Rus, you had these great river networks through Russia down all the way from the Volga and what have you. So there was this, I guess you could say the argument was an easier form of access, but particularly with Prussia and Livonia, very densely wooded valleys as well. Um, and also another thing is, as noted, that and I think this was the attitude by the um, Teutonic order and their friars and monks is that there was this, as you mentioned, there is like a form of primitivism when it comes to these people, even though I think sometimes it's a bit overstated. I mean, they did have tracks. They're in the eastern part of Prussia. There were the Iron Age footpath that you see in some parts of southwest England. You did have similar ones that would be like these tracks that would go into Lithuania, and so there would be, it's not like they were entirely isolated societies, but they were. Um, Almost like the Celtic society of when the Romans arrived in Britain. They would live out. They would have like these hillock forts or these forest forts, and they would live in the local tribe or clan or what have you would live around them. And then depending on some of the tribes would be more open to outsiders, maybe the ones that experience, particularly along the coastlines, they would have more experience. But then you'd have some of one of the tribes in the I think it was the Samarkans. They would have this habit of um, if if a woman in a tribe gave birth to a baby girl, they would kill the baby girl because in their mind that um, a girl has no use. They can just kidnap from either a neighboring tribe or into the Christian lands to get a woman to reproduce or something. So you had like this sort of very, even by this time, archaic forms of society. The other things they do mention as well, the Czech prelate, is that there is no written or even like attempted sort of form of language, even like when you can compare it to the rune in sort of Scandinavia or what have you. There seems to be nothing developed like that for them. So when it came to missionary work, um, how could you communicate to them or even get them to understand um, monotheism? This was sort of the problems that a lot of the Teutonics and various missionaries found. And then, of course, the most obvious thing is very violent societies. If to do missionary work, you have to cast down their gods, and on numerous occasions when that happened, missionaries would be martyred. They would just kill them. So it I don't want to say they're total savages, but there is that nature where they were just treated as I think it was one Russian chronicler said, "Well, we'll just leave them in their woods," like referring to the Estonians. We'll just leave them in their woods, leave them to dwell in their woods. Um, and that was, I guess, the attitude at the time. But it it is interesting. I mean, for me, the Grand Duchy, or the Duchy and then Grand Duchy of Lithuania was kind of different because later on they would engage in I mean they would expand their territory largely thanks to the arrival of the Mongols, but they would expand uh, territory to where they'd be ruling over large parts of Russian land, Orthodox land, where the majority of their subjects would be Orthodox. Um, and so you know, they were able to um, develop a society, but also try and keep the promises of maybe to in the West of, well, we will adopt Roman Catholicism, or no, we'll adopt Orthodoxy, and families within the Lithuanian nobility would, even before their official conversion, would marry or be baptized in one or the other. So, um, but yeah, I don't know if that answers your question there. Um, on that point, AM.
To be honest, I don't think I will have a satisfactory answer to this question, but it just strikes me as odd,
It,
to put it
it,
very
it
mildly.
I also, I mean, one thing I noticed is what's quite interesting is this problem of missionary work, of actually converting them to Christianity, is the only thing it has in common, AM, is that they're all Baltic people. You know, they're all Baltic, and all of their sort of hostility to for accepting Christianity is quite similar. That there is like the similar process of it's there's a war, there's conflict, a monastic order rules over them, and then there's a rebellion, and then maybe some of the tribes will accept it to get status, and then it's like a slow, drawn out process. You don't really see that. I mean, you do have pagan reactions when Hungary under Saint Stephen converted to Christianity, and even in Poland as well. Um, and of course with Russia as well, when they adopted Christianity, you had we talk about Novgorod. There were pagan uh, revolts and riots up there that had to be put down. But I do wonder if there is something within like the Baltic people which is different from other European peoples. Why there is this sort of you know, maybe they were more tribal. I don't know. It's something I've wondered as well. Um, it's it's one of those mysteries, I guess.
Well, I mean, it's not a case of all the Baltic either. I mean, you mentioned the consistency of the pagan religion. What distinguishes Lithuania from the other Baltic states is that, unlike the other Baltic states, which remain fragmented, is that Lithuania will actually go on whilst remaining pagan and conquer one of the largest states in Europe, reaching their height in the 14th and the 15th centuries. It's not until the 14th century that they finally convert to Catholicism. So, it seems possible to establish a form of pagan unity, if not even empire, as the Lithuanians ultimately achieve. But it just seems, I mean, like I said, it's a tangential point, and I simply don't understand the logic regarding the various interests, the various powers in the region. And I mean, also look at it from the point of view of a missionary. Um, the prospect of the Russians becoming Catholic was a major point of concern in the 13th century, as is the time period we're talking about. Indeed, there was seemingly a prospect, according to the great legend, where Vladimir the Great hosted all of the emissaries of the religions in Europe, that Kiev, and by extension the Russian principalities, could have converted to Catholicism as much as they could have converted to Orthodoxy. So looking at this territory, which basically straddles, the cultural extremity of Catholicism and Orthodoxy, it surprises me that there wasn't a harder contest. I mean, it's probably interesting to actually go into the justification for the Crusade itself, because this period, the end of the 12th century, is a period not just of crusades in the Levant, as you've already referred to with the Third Crusade, which is only a mitigated success. They're not able to take over Jerusalem. But we have the Albigensian Crusade, which is directed against a internal, quote unquote, Christian heresy of the Cathars in the Languedoc. And this is the time that we also have the Livonian Crusade. So the whole scope of the crusade is expanding all across Europe to deal with external Islamic threats, pagan threats, albeit this had been something well established around the time of the Second Crusade, as you mentioned, with the Vends. And now the whole notion of a quote unquote internal crusade, where you have Catholic rulers ostensibly harboring non-Catholic subjects, and therefore permitting the situation where you basically have civil war in the south of France. Again, it's quite convincing, the point you make about Livonia and pagan society being susceptible to the murder of missionaries. But the murder of missionaries, you can say, is really where the impetus for the justification for the crusade starts, because at the end of the first millennium, there was one Adalbert of Prague, who was later retroactively considered the patron saint of Prussia, who was able to convincingly spread the gospel to Hungary, which converted shortly after under St. Stephen, and to Poland, which also became a major Catholic kingdom. But when he arrived in Prussia, he was killed by the Prussian pagans. You've also alluded to there the fact that these societies almost uniquely were hostile to women, especially in terms of public space and propaganda and everything. So slavery was somewhat endemic in these societies, and so you had slave raids, and you had this huge sort of back and forth regarding the conquest and conversion of Christian subjects, and then a counteroffensive by the pagans, and then all of these Christians would then revert back to their previous religion. So it seems again like the Vendish sort of situation that was allowed to sort of linger on for 200 years, that you have this problem, as it were, for Christendom right in the heart of this battleground between Orthodoxy and Catholicism, and no one seems to have essentially the ability to deal with it. I mean, you mentioned the Teutonic Order. What we should really be alluding to is that this should be seen as a major failure of Polish expansionism and Polish power, because the idea of taking over the Terra Mariana and the Prussian sort of lands of the Teutonic Order and establishing not just a few castles which are held over by the Teutonic Order, but we're talking about really a knightly empire. This is really quite unprecedented. I mean, you mentioned the Hospitallers. The Hospitallers won't get a domain of their own until Rhodes is ceded to them at the end of the 13th century. The Knights Templar, of course, will never have a strong sort of national stronghold which they can resist, say, for example, the forced dissolution at the hand of the French, other Christian monarchs, and in other areas, their inclusion into the Hospitallers. So to take this very nascent order, which again, before von Salza, had only received limited recognition as a fighting order, really sort of carrying on in the vein of the much better established orders, the Templars and the Hospitallers, that it can, by the beginning of the 1220s, assume this role of not just again fighting pagans, but expanding and establishing an empire under a nominal fiefdom of the Pope. It's in many ways, in the medieval context, revolutionary, especially in terms of completely reconfiguring the strategic reality that we see in this region. And as I hope that you and I have been at pains to explain, that it's almost, one should be incredulous as to why this region wasn't conquered by other powers in the first place.
No, absolutely, and it is this. And yeah, there is like this bizarre nature of why, even when it came to Poland, why this was this I mean, I've just got the map up here, but it also is same with Pomerania, which was still followed a form of paganism up until what was it? It would have been after the after the Second Crusade. So even in relatively speaking, that it's the Sventopol and his realm is relatively recently Christianized, and the and that was down to again Germans, but also Danish as well. Um, But one thing you notice with this particular one is that the trigger point for this is the raids, particularly from Kulmerland, which you see in the south of the most southern point near the Vistula River there, where of course you would have the great forts of Thorn and Vogelsong, which would be these great strongholds, was largely depopulated. The Poles and the Pomeranians were engaging in these battles of depopulating and raiding, and of course the Prussians would as well. Like the Lubavari and the Galindia would raid deep into Masovian and Polish territories, and the Pomesanians as well into Pomerania. And so you would have like these as you said, this is like endless back and forth, and it resulted of course in this this stalemate, and it's a lot of it it came down to manning the forts along the border, along the Vistula, and navigating this, this very dense. And the reason I apologize if I'm banging on about it, but the forests of Prussia were uniquely dense at that time. It was um, with mixed with swamps and largely uncharted, uh, region when it comes to the rivers. They weren't even sure about the river network as well, in great detail. And so when it came to it, these sort of forts and these frontier areas, manning it was a problem, and that is why the Teutonic Knights, of course, would be invited uh, into the region, because they were sworn to, poverty, chastity. They were not, landed nobles of and secular knights, so they could stay throughout the harsh winters. Um, and the uh, you know uh, downfalls in autumn, they could stay and man and sort of hold those positions. Um, and that was the strength of that was the reason, particularly for the Duke of Mazovia, for inviting them in, because there was this constant. It's also worth mentioning, actually, I have forgotten to mention one knightly order um, um, in Prussia here, which was created again, was the Order of Dorben, which was, again, a very relatively small order, similar heraldry to the Livonian uh, sword brothers, where there would be this red star with a sword facing downwards underneath, quite similar to the Templar um, emblem. And they would be uh, they would effectively be wiped out um, relatively quickly by a Prussian um, raiding party, and they uh, this was so there were attempts as well, and they were the Order of Dorben. They were uh, providing assistance to Cistercian missionaries from Poland. Um, so even up until the last moment, there were missionary work again with the Pomesanians and Pomegenians and the uh, Lubavarians and so on, that you see in the border of Poland. There were active missionary, but at the end of the day, it was just getting nowhere, and the raiding was. And this is of sort of, again, something it's a bit of a mystery. There's a lot of theories out there, but there was one theory that the raiding was getting worse and worse as time was going on, and it could be that that there were external trading going on with Prussian tribes like the Sambians and the Natangia there, where you see what would be modern Königsberg and the Vistula, entry to the Vistula River there. So it the one theory that I've seen is that around this time the population of Prussia was also increasing, and so this was triggering even more raids, even more excursions into neighboring territory as well. So this was that's one theory, but there does seem to be like an uptick in that.
Well, if you look at on this map and you look at the location of Pomezania in particular, and the raids and the attempt to conquer what in this map is shown as the Kalmar land, which nowadays will be Chelmno. The significance of this is that, again, for people who don't know, the history of Poland in the 12th century was especially fraught, kind of like what we see with Russia. There is a period of internal political fragmentation, which again can sort of account for my sort of incredulity as to why this region wasn't conquered earlier. But the lifeline for Poland in terms of its ability to conduct trade with Germany in particular is controlling the Vistula. And so expanding into Kurmaland, allowing for these pagans basically to cut off the Vistula, would by extension cut off most of Poland's trade with the rest of the world, especially with the Scandinavian countries. So increasingly, as the situation in Poland seems ever more dire, the pagan threat is basically metamorphosed into something as really equating to an existential threat for Polish survival. The only sort of thing that could make the situation worse if we replace larger, more emboldened raiding parties who are prepared to again reconvert, Christians back to paganism, but like we have with Lithuania, a unified state. So, with all of those considerations, you can basically look at the invitation of the knights as a preemptive attempt, essentially, to prevent that happening.
Yes. And I've also got sort of another bit of it. There was a Cistercian monk called Theodoric who was part of the missionary effort in Riga, in Livonia and Estonia, who was relatively successful in converting pagans there, particularly ones friendly to the Archbishop of Riga. Was again uh, um, asked by fellow monks why they couldn't convert do the same in Prussia, and the response was basically it was too complicated. The response to the official response was it probably wouldn't work and it's complicated. And there was and the funny thing is, you get to this point where with Theodoric and the Cistercian monks there, they actually don't view the pagans as much of a threat. Their main focus of concern is, of course, with the Orthodox Russians to the east, and in fact, there is this sort of belief that you know a heretic is worse than someone who is effectively a pagan infidel in that regard.
Or
That's
perhaps it's more a feeling of the conversion of these peoples is inevitable, and having a orthodox state in the region would be a more potent threat in terms of resisting Catholic entreaties than the pagan one.
yeah, yeah, and um, I think it's also, this is just an observation from myself, is and th- when we talked about on here the previous streams with the Crusade in the Holy Land, there is this there's obviously the added part to it that the Crusaders in their mind are going there to reclaim land, holy relics, and cities belonging to the origins of Christianity, the birthplace of Christianity, and all its saints, all its martyrs, all of its entire origin state. You don't get this with the Northern Crusade. There isn't the holy sites or anything like that, and so there is sort of like a different dynamic, I guess you could say, with the Northern Crusades, particularly with the Prussian Crusade as well. Um,
Well, the idea with the Crusader, is to take the cross. And so, if you're wanting to receive absolution, you're there to protect the pilgrimage routes. Um, and by extension, future crusades are simply reduced to that of a pilgrimage. It's not simply a matter of fighting your ways to these sites each time. Whereas in this situation, this is an accusation that's also labeled the so-called Frankish expansionism in the Levant, hence why we have terms like outremer, outremer, to refer to the Crusader principalities in the east. It would seem that when it comes to the lands east of the River Elbe, that the colonial aspect is more foremost in terms of the overall ambitions and goals of the various parties, not just in terms of colonialism, in terms of setting up new archbishoprics, establishing new merchant cities such as Riga and even Lübeck, it should be mentioned, and allowing for various German princes to carve out new territories, and another form of colonialism, which is establishing monastic states, starting in the Kurmaland, as you can see, and expanding out to include a vast empire in the Baltic. So if you look at it that way, then it certainly has a different dynamic when you pair it with the whole notion of the Aussiedlung, the German eastern settling, which is already a process that had begun before the conquest of the Prussian
Mm.
lands. But in the case of Prussia, a lot of people look at the process of conversion and assimilation and the overall decline in the Prussian language and equate it to a genocide. Even though, if we're going to look at this as a genocide, we're talking about a process of cultural assimilation that will take roughly 500 years for the old Prussian population to basically become indistinguishable from the German population. But yes, that is certainly an angle that one can take vis-a-vis the viability of these as pilgrimage sites, especially as they are basically completely and utterly irrelevant to broader Christian significance.
Yeah, it's yeah, and so when it comes to Teutonic Knights, entering Prussia, so we'll get on to the the, the force itself. So the Teutonic Knights, von Salsa sent a small force um, to um, uh, to Kumaland, uh, led by Konrad von Landsberg, who was from the German Messian and was quite well versed in Polish territory in that region and the customs as well. I believe he could even speak some of the local dialects of the Pomeranians and Polish as well. So he was one of the reasons why he was picked by the Grand Master. Um, Now, his army was relatively small. It was made up of uh, young new recruits and also quite old and um, it says here infirm, but I think what they mean is old and probably wouldn't be able to survive a trip all the way to Palestine, but could survive a couple weeks journey to the frontier of Prussia. So you had this sort of interesting force of young, fresh raw recruits and old and veterans who probably wouldn't make it to the Holy Land.
This should be mentioned that this is coming after the Polish Mazovian debacle, which leads to the bizarre situation where this, again, relatively nascent order is brought in to resolve the crisis.
Yes, and because of course Conrad of Mazovia, as I mentioned, he created the Order of the Doberines, small knightly order, and they were wiped out fighting in Volhynia, I think, as well. Again, it it was and this invitation, which had gone out and had been negotiated um, beforehand, was the. I mean, of course, this would come to bite the Poles and the Pomeranians sort of in the long term. Bit of an understatement, but it would still come back to bite them. But largely the force that was made up, there were of Landsberg, you had Poles, you had Pomeranians, and you also had a few Bohemians, and as well as obviously Germans as well. So there was um, um, separate from the order, but armies that were attaching themselves, those attaching themselves to this expedition by Landsberg, and uh, with Bishop, the Conrad did agree to the initial demand, as well as Bishop Christian, to give the order a foothold of in Prussia, in Kumaland, and be able to build the um, fort at Vogelsson on the Vistula, and then a year later they would build the fort as well of Thorn as well.
Hello?
Oh, sorry. Sorry. I think can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. It's just there's a bit of dead air there. I was just wondering if you lost connection.
I think. Yeah. I think I'm. No. I think I might have done. So Conrad Landsberg, he gathered a handful of knights from convents in central Germany, as I mentioned, taking up new recruits and warriors who were ill or injured, who weren't able to join the Grand Master when he set sail to the Holy Land. Um, there were only seven knights that accompanied by 70 to 100 squires and armored sergeants and servants as well in this expedition. Um, as it was the order was a cloistered order as well as the hospital order, there were priests, doctors with them as well too. All were male, and the attendants at um, held 8 religious services each day, and it was a major function that took up much of their time. But they were well armed, well equipped, and incredibly well trained, even the younger troops, um, and were particularly the monks as well, where you start to see these these sort of layman friar types who also these extraordinary warriors as well. Um, so Conrad of Landsberg didn't enter directly into Culm at the strategic bend of the Vistula River, but stayed to the south bank in Mazovia, where Duke Conrad had built a small castle uh, opposite the future location of Thorn, um, which, as I mentioned, was called Vogelsang, which in Vogelsong, which in German means bird song. Um, and the chronicler Nicholas von Jurchen explained that there sang many a wounded man, not as the nightingale sings, but with the sorrowful song that the swan sings as he is killed. This was because the fort itself was largely also a refuge for many of the Poles and remnants of the order, the Dorburin order, and others in this fighting, this sort of a battlefield landscape, and it it was also the hospital as well. So this was when they were arriving there, it was pretty gruesome, as the knights would sort of go on to say, and their medics would then go on to help and ingrain themselves in there. The Teutonic order couldn't hold out against the large Prussian armies that were roaming, but uh, the uh, Cumberland had been largely depopulated due to earlier Polish invasions, and some of the local natives um, who had negotiated with Duke Conrad and Bishop Christian of Mazovia converted to Christianity, and were beginning to use as forms of auxiliary, which we will see the Teutonic Order uh, offer similar rights as well for Prussians who convert to Christianity. Um, so the pagan population in Kulm was not large, really at all, and um, Landsberg didn't really consider those in Kumaland as a serious threat. Um, More so that it was the Pomesanians and the neighbouring tribes as being that could muster a large force and raid within Kumaland, Masovia, and Pomerania. Um, So this was a mistake. Once Conrad van Lansberg had completed his castle/convent, he sent his knights across the Vista River to cut down the nearest pagan warriors, to burn their fields and villages and destroy their crops. He offered peace only on the condition that the people become Christian. AM, do you have anything to add at all? You wanted to?
No, I'm just I can't really offer much in terms of very granular details. So I'm just sitting, listening, and learning.
Cool. So during this period as well, Bishop William of Modena, the papal legate, was in Prussia, um, and this Italian prelate was well versed in Baltic affairs, being previously serving in the Livonia and Estonia missions as well, and as well as the conflicts there. And he had just arrived from Denmark. Where he'd been in negotiations um, with the king Waldemar II over the Livonian Crusade and further Livonian action in the region. From Livonia, he sailed to Prussia, where he was present on the late summer of 1228, or early spring of 1229. And before January the 1230, he then arrived back in Italy, where he was confirming with Hermann von Salza information about the legate's activity is rather scant, and the translations aren't particularly great. But one thing that it does show is that he was able to convert a few of the Pomesanians and Pomeranians north of Colm, and was able to get some of access and information beforehand, which kind of makes sense given the initial uh, attacks by the Teutonic Order after Cumberland as they go northwards, and will go into those regions. And it seems like that they already had some native local allies already waiting, and providing services as going forward. And this was thanks to the papal legate.
I just want
Um,
to ask you, if possible. I mean, you've been stressing the relative how inhospitable these territories were vis-a-vis the rest of Christendom, the marshes and the forests. And I would have imagined that on the Polish frontier there would have been a cross profusion of the pagan population and the Catholic population, if nothing else, in terms of just not just raiding but trading with the various territories for centuries, as they have become very much settled at
mm.
this point. So is it really that surprising that there would be willing auxiliaries, or indeed people on both sides who could speak the languages?
No, and the people of Kumaland and Pomesania and Pomegania that we see in like the western portion seem to be the ones um, who were um, the Prussians who were more open to conversions to Christianity, and uh, assimilating into either Teutonic society, uh, working with the Masovians or Pomeranians, though that just and I think also the fact of the river access, and they were like obviously trading, but then if you take Bartia like in the center, or the Gladini, these seems to be the ones that were more prone to uh violent forms of slavery, particularly the Galandi, which were the ones that were noted as not accepting women in their society. One of the ones that seemed that were the more sort of brutal form, and would there's one particularly uh, interesting character called um, I think it was Herman von Golben, and he was captured. He was a German settler who was captured as a boy, him and his family and his sister, his pregnant sister, and they were taken into slavery. And upon seeing that she was pregnant, they tied her to a tree and killed her, chopped her head off, uh, just because she couldn't work in the fields and what have you.
It's interesting,
So
isn't it, that this is all painting a picture of these people being violent, misogynist, slaver pirates. It's not exactly a very rosy picture that's been painted for the Prussians.
it's a difficult one because in contemporary times, usually it's particularly after the last 80 years, the Teutonic Order are the ones sort of viewed as the vile, horrible invaders, and the Prussians are these sweet, innocent.
Well, you can
Uh,
understand that, can't you? Because it's
yes, yeah,
anti-German and anti-Catholic.
yeah,
Whereas in this situation, of course, it's simply a matter of history being flipped and the revisionism going from one extreme to another. So, if anything, like with quite a few things, it's interesting to see that the revisionism is starting to flit in the other direction again, if that's true.
yeah. And my author here that I've sort of been quoting from throughout the book does, obviously broaches that obvious post World War II, and the Teutonic Order, the iconography of German militarism and the legacy of Prussia, and you can sort of draw upon all that, but ultimately the um
Well, I mean,
there's
there's the more obvious point, of course, which is to focus on German quote unquote genocidal intent, is to completely ignore the fact that the German population there does not exist and was completely and utterly expelled, and the population that exists now is Polish in the south and Russian in the north. So the
yeah,
irony seems to be lost on these people who are claiming Prussian genocide on the one hand, whilst failing to look at the demographics of quote unquote Prussia today.
yeah, 100%. And that's it's yeah and for people who want to pick up this subject, there's a chap called Christian Sinner who's got a good book. Though unfortunately a lot of the topics around, if you even like online YouTube videos and stuff like that, when you on the Teutonic Knights, a lot of it's just going to be, well, what you can imagine, I guess. Genocidal eastward expansion. um but yeah, so going back to the William Madonna had uh, was able to negotiate as well, because what would happen during these raids when the Teutonic Knights were in Kumaland is they did end up raiding the knights, that is, raiding and engaging in operations where they would kill um recently converted Prussian Christians. And so there were the now this happened only on like a handful of occasions. This wasn't like a regular thing. So there, and this was not even a lot of the knights weren't aware this was just down to communication at the time. But what William of Modena was able to do was to stop the Teutonic Knights from attacking settlements in Culm completely, um, and redirecting the across the and even traveling up the Vistula River, um, where into areas where they hadn't been established yet. Um, and so this was the beginning of greater reconnaissance within um, Prussia. And so you're going, further up to the Black Sea, but also into central Prussia itself. Um,
Baltic Sea.
sorry, into the Baltic Sea. I said the Prussian Sea, didn't I? Into the Baltic Sea. And um, he also encouraged landsmen, the knights, a handful of knights sergeants, to start learning the local language and customs as well, and even learning when it comes to customs, learning the religious practices of the native pagans as well, um, which again, you know, if they're genocidal, doesn't sound like. Does that sound like Anyway, yeah,
Well, I was just curious about this because obviously we know quite a lot about Lithuanian religious practices because their pagan religion was the longest sort of lasting out of all of Europe's established pagan religions. And of course, as you know, when it came to the Latvians and the Lithuanians, there was a great pagan revivalist movement in the 1920s and 30s. But when it comes to the Prussians, it seems that they practiced a variety of beliefs. But an interesting fact about them, which probably, again, do correct me if I'm wrong on this, but it seems that rather than being polytheistic in a way that we would perhaps understand in terms of like the other sort of extant sort of pagan religions, they almost seem to be animists in terms of the worshipping of sort of ever-present spirits and the spirits in the forms of all of nature's forces. That and also ancestor worship at the same time. So it seemed a peculiar mesh of a lot of different sort of influences that we would perhaps again associate more
yeah.
in the modern day, especially in terms of Anglophone and American opinion with Native Americans. But yes, a weird sort of religious panoply in Prussia.
It is different. It is different than a lot of the um pagan, the sort of um Lithuanians. One thing that's quite interesting is William Moderna, and the other Teutonic Knights very much have, whether or not they believe this, but this is just commentary, is that they do go on to say that the Prussians believe that their gods live in the forests within them, within the forests. Their gods walk among the forests, and so there is that clear animist, society there, where it is like an element of nature worship. Um, it's which is different in a sense, and it's one of the reasons why. I mean, you could say, going back to our previous point, we were trying to, like, why was it difficult for missionaries, when they go from converting the Polish, pagans, and then and
Well,
stuff.
would you say it's a point of reference? Because in many pagan societies, they were able, especially in terms of the Virgin Mary, especially, they were able to take a obvious sort of analog to a fertility goddess, and they were able to take the cult and basically subsume it into the cult of the Virgin, especially after the sort of 11th century. But when you look at this, again, if you're looking at animism in a very primal form, then it's far more difficult to
Yeah,
establish a new cult because you don't really have a template from which to basically substitute it.
I would say so, and the way that I'm, maybe as a point of reference, is when you look at, and I've done reading on the on Cortez, when he and the Spanish arrival in central Mexico, and the attempted conversion during his time, and the use of the Virgin Mary and the saints to try and find that, you know common ground, that they could understand the Roman Catholic religion, and then, as the spread of the Spanish Empire, um, New Spain, further north, that they go, and then it does when it gets to the more native, as I said, the animist, you know, Native Americans, it does, it doesn't have that same effect. And I do wonder, you know, a lot of these missionaries, particularly in what we were talking about here, as you said, they go from maybe not fully understanding the society that they were trying to convert. They sort of applied maybe like a template for, a pagan society, like similar to that of the Slavs, or the maybe even like the Saxons beforehand, and it was just not uh, probably thought out, maybe understood in full, and it's probably why it didn't work, and maybe why there was quite a bit of hostility. Because when as you said, there is a primordial nature to this. That if they believe that their gods walk among them in the woods and the trees and everything, how do you how do you detach them from that? Even if you do present them with like a figure like the Virgin Mary as a form of fertility, you can't like I don't know how you could do like a syncretic religious um sort of syncretic religious workaround with this.
Well, when it comes to Christianity, they're very careful again to distinguish between a template and syncretism. Pagan cultures tend to be able to syncretize different gods and adopt them and include them in their own pantheon. I think it's the combination of a lack of a well-established system of polytheism combined with the lack of a written culture. All of this again would seem to doom traditional missionary work.
Mm, no, yeah, I think, that that's something that again Albert of Riga, he points out, and the Livonian brothers found out as well. Um, and it's why, the final stage was, of course, the use of warfare.
And again,
So
that's just an interesting general point that perhaps animism is naturally the most resistive force to monotheism, not just in terms of Christianity, but all forms of monotheism, and accounting for why this particular brand of paganism lasted as long as it did.
I think that's fair. I mean, in some ways, they are quite diametrically opposed on a civilizational spectrum of faith and
Well, I
religion.
mean, perhaps you could come to them with the Calvinist arguments about the spirit of God and the essence being everywhere, but you're not exactly going to be able to make these arguments to Prussian illiterates in the 13th century.
Maybe not. No, there was. I wonder if that's. Just trying to think. There's that small region in India where there is like a Presbyterian, um, uh, a converted an Aminist. I think it was in near Bengal. There's still province. I wonder if that. Anyway, yeah. So I don't know if it's ever worked out in theory at all, but yeah. So going forward, um, um, in 1230, so few couple years later, sorry, a year later, reinforcements under the command of Master Hermann Bulk rode into Vogelsong, and he was more experienced crusader warrior who had actually been on the Crusades, and had been present as well in Hungary. So he brought a larger force of experience, and also engaged in fighting within uh, Livonia as well, and the borderlands of Prussia years earlier. So he was well known to in the region, and also. uh, um, quite hard, described as a reasonable and considerate man, but also rather um, had no tolerance or patience or mercy for pagans or heretics, um, or um, uh, the infidels. Among Christians of any kind, German, Poles, Prussians, he seems to have some level of respect and trust. The traditions he established were upheld in their essentials for the rest of the century, right down to the Master's seal depicting the fight of the Holy Family into Egypt, the flight of the Holy Family into Egypt, perhaps symbolizing Bulk's preeminence. He was the only Master's seal to bear his name. All others were anonymous. Um, Salsa had been able to send this party of knights because he was at last free from his extraordinary commitments in the Holy Land. Although now he had greater responsibilities there than before the Imperial Crusade, a truce was in effect, and the usual number of troops was not required. And so you had this sort of round of recruitment and enlistment across Germany, but also back in the Holy Land, to increase I guess you could say, increase the awareness of what was going on in Prussia, um, and ultimately to increase garrisons in the recently acquired forts and land.
Well, I mean, just in terms of what is being referenced, Frederick II um, goes on crusade in the 1220s, and he takes over Jerusalem. A point that's often forgotten by a lot of sort of contemporary medieval history is that Jerusalem was reconquered. And the Teutonic Order, being Hermann von Salza in particular, being close to the emperor, is granted a new series of castles all across the slightly reconsolidated Kingdom of Jerusalem. But as far as the empire is concerned, you have to look at this and see the large German contingent um, coming over. And this is an opportunity to expand imperial influence into Prussia at the same time, because it's not simply a matter of being Catholics against pagans. We've already talked about the Orthodox dynamic, but now we need to look at the ultimate sovereignty over these slowly but surely accumulating territories in the 1230s, whether it's going to be the Polish Grand Duke or High Duke, the Holy Roman Emperor, or indeed the Pope. And as we'll see, the Pope, in theory, will win that contest, but as far as the Hohenstaufens are concerned, it's something that they much want to perceive as a continuation of imperial power into the Baltic.
Yeah, and we'd also see with Bulk, I guess you could say, sort of a bit of rivalry with Bishop Christian of Mazovia and Conrad, and this was effectively the problem of what to do with Culm and it being occupied, but also this understanding that Conrad, in his understanding, gave them Kumaland as a point of um, as a frontier, but also to effectively restore it. Now, um, Bulk, pretty being a bit German about it, maybe, um, basically said that they haven't administered it or done it properly. So no, this it will not become your land because you can't govern it effectively. And so this all caused a bit of a breakdown. And he reminded them, of course, though the orders previous negotiation that the um, um, of what was agreed beforehand. So uh, but this also meant that the Teuton Knights, who would have to remain in Culm to defend it um, uh, from from the rest of the Prussians. Um, Bulk went to the Duke and the Bishop, um, and basically threatened them with the Hungarian debacle, i.e., saying, "Well, if you push us too much, we'll just pull out." And then what are you going to do? Effect effectively. Um, Whether or not he had the authority to do that, but he did tell them about the, you know, when they were forced out, they said we will all go, and then there'll be nothing, nothing left for you guys to defend on your frontier. So um, um, there was a renegotiation uh, to uh, grant sovereignty and more similar grant by the emperor in the Golden Bull of Rimini in 1226, uh, which this had been proposed, and the debate, even sort of today with German and Polish historians, is what I mean. Effectively, from my understanding of reading it, because the Poles were desperate and because they weren't doing very well, they did promise them lands to effectively govern, um, and to provide missionary work. And then when everything started going well, they tried to go back on the promise. And Bulk reminded them of their oaths and obligations in the papal bull, um, and it seems that the papacy did back uh, the Teutonic order up on this, and there was nothing they could really do, Conrad of Masovia. So yeah, this was a pretty much like a political ploy. Um,
I mean, you could argue, obviously, there's a lot of Polish sort of national, sort of strong national feeling about this. But you could argue that it was actually a galvanizing moment in the long term for Poland because they were useless against the Prussians, but ultimately against the Teutonic Order, Poland would not only reunify in the 14th century, but in the 15th century, it would form a union with the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. It would subjugate Prussia, and during the early modern period, it would be one of the greatest states in Europe. So ultimately, it resolved quite well for them in terms of uniting all of the immediate neighbors against the Teutonic Order.
yes, true. Yeah. Um, and so within the next few years, an army of Pomeranians and Germans would continually arrive, and they launched a campaign up the Vistula, and they would conquer, and basically flood into Pomerania, the tribe on the in pink on the map there, and Pomerania, and they would the Teutonic Order would create the um, settlement, the fortress of Marienwerter in the middle of Pomerania, um, a key point on the Vistula and halfway between Thorn and the sea. And the Crusaders' um, knights would stay there while most of the army would return back home during the winter months. Um, and uh, this would be backed up by Duke Sventopelk and Sambor of Pomerania, who would then plan for the following year invasions into Pomerania. Um, Here, the pagans would come out in a what they describe a phalanx formation on the frozen surface of the Siguni River. They were quickly panicked by appearance of Pomeranian cavalry in their rear, and the effort to flee turned into a massacre. And the uh, uh, Pomeranians were quickly wiped out; their forces wiped out. The Count of Mission was important in the Greater Offensive of 1236 to 37, and he built large sailing ships for the order, and then would go on to sink small pagan vessels that would came out to challenge them um, in Wa- Wamia, out from Wamia. and they would be used to transport men downstream from along the Vistula. Uh, Pog uh, Essenian militia came out to fight um, during this conflict. Would come out to fight and be part of the auxiliary force for the order, um, though they were quite unreliable, and on several occasions they fled armored Prussian cavalry, which would be the Prussian tribal nobility, um, on the battlefield. But the Prussians would develop a battlefield tactic of effectively like a guerrilla warfare. Um, in here it says it was harder to find the pagans in the woods and swamps, especially in the summer, but in winter, a season of war which the Crusaders came to specialize, they could easily track them back to their lairs. Like footprints and snow and horse prints and what have you. Each year, small Crusader armies came to Prussia, and each year the result was the same, an expansion of the Order's conquest. Many of these volunteers were Polish, and everyone involved in this crusade understood that without the steadfast support of the PS and Pomeranian dukes, the volunteers who came from Germany would have done little besides provide garrisons for the castles already constructed. When then, if the Poles were doing it so much uh, fighting, they would also be the ones to return home, and leaving the German knights to stay. So to assist, and this is where I think again you see more of a conflict in during the occupation of newly conquered territories by the Teutonic Order. Knights, they would open up vacant lands in Culm to secular knights, though this was rather few and far between, um, and most of them were from Poland itself. So they weren't exactly Germans. This wasn't like a German colonization, but you would see, though, in relations to um, Kreisberg and Marienwerth and Pomerania, the arrival of German settlers, um, particularly with the Charter of Culm. Um, these immigrants weren't numerous, though they would uh, come so at the end of the 13th century, and were even more plentiful in the 14th century. A large part of the fighting force was composed of Prussian militiamen and nobles, the former serving as infantry and later serving as cavalry. Um, um, During the following decade into 1237, there were other distractions for the order. The knights incorporated the local military order of Livonia, the Sword Brothers, and thereby, due to one of the defeats during their campaigns, which wiped out a good portion of the order membership, and thereby took additional responsibilities in Livonia that required men and material to be diverted north. And Pope Gregory also at this point excommunicated Emperor Frederick, um, uh, precipitating a long, costly struggle that tore Germany apart, as well as the arrival of the Mongols in 1241 to 1242, devastating Galicia, Volhynia, Hungary, Poland, and a great deal of the Rus territories bordering in Lithuania. As a result of the Teutonic Order's governance structure, you would have the chapter of Prussia and the chapter of Livonia with their own masters and then the Grand Master above that. So the Livonian order was, even though it was disbanded, it was seen as equal to the Teutonic chapter in Prussia. So native nobles, being the converted Prussians, um, had insufficient income to allow them to function as full-time as warriors and ministries, nor did the Teutonic Order want to disperse its potential incomes by creating a secular class of secular knights. The masters gave away few fiefs, and most of those were small grants and culm given to Polish knights. The masters appointed members of the Teutonic Order to lead the native troops, known as advocates. These lived with their charges, so they were usually fluent in Prussian and understood the customs well. These advocates, though, while making up a bulk of the force, weren't bound by the religious orders rules in regards to chastity and poverty and what have you. A great number of the order members going forward as they expand weren't beholden to such rules as well, which is quite interesting. It was something that they, which makes sense because you couldn't have a functional state in that regard.
Yes, we have to see this as a well, it sort of begins with Magdeburg law to Culm law, this
Yeah,
process over the last 300 years of building little German entrepots, expanding outwards. Of course, the whole point of a monastic order isn't to create a new colony because obviously it's a genetic dead end. So they have to act as the vanguard and the defenders of whatever colonial structure is going to inhabit those territories,
yeah,
and also assuming that there are local Prussian populations who are going to be amenable and won't simply spend the rest of the 13th century in constant uprisings, which of course they do. So the way to offset that is to bring in even more colonists from the rest of the world.
yeah. The Livonian branch as well. They were making further advancements along the um, south of Riga into um, areas that would be the Lithuanian territories. And um, in 1250, Mindaugas of Lithuania accepted Roman Catholicism, thus removing the initial justifications from the chapters of attacks in Lithuania and then within Mindaugas's lands. Um, and to a large extent, that would remain the case, though. Uh,
Well, a lot of people have, and a lot of members of the order, because this is quite later on, essentially the main order crusade expands as far as Varmia. Some of the most populated areas you can see are in the north, around what is now the city of Kaliningrad. But a lot of opinion is that when Mindaugas, the only king of Livonia, converted to Catholicism, it was only a temporary relief because his successors would revert back
yeah,
to being pagans. And a lot of the conflict, first of all, there was a dramatic intervention by the Lithuanians under his own forces to prop up the Prussians, and that resulted in the practical dissolution of the Order of Dobrin, which you were mentioning. And then there was the issue about uniting the Prussian and the Livonian orders through the conquest of Samogita. The Lithuanians, interestingly, basically abandoned that region. They were content to allow it to be a buffer state between these two zones. But Samogita, interesting enough, was never conquered, and so there was never a established hard continuous territory between the Livonian and the Prussian territories, as the Lithuanians were content basically to retreat further inland to Kaunas and Vilnius.
Yeah, yeah, that and uh, that would be a point in contention even for centuries, really, for Lithuania. Um, so um, shortly thereafter, Prussian resistance and slowly began to collapse into 1256, and then King Ottokar of the Second of Bohemia, the most powerful ruler at the time of the Holy Roman Empire, led to Samerland, um, up in the you know, northern
Well, Samland
parts
is
of
probably one of the richest and most powerful of all these sort of the tribal
yeah.
regions, and of course it'll be the crown jewel in later ducal Prussia, and then part of royal Prussia, or rather royal Prussian territory. Um, and what we're seeing really is you mentioned earlier about a few hundred knights. As the campaigns progress, we're talking about 1,000 knights and then 10,000 knights. And we start off with the intervention of you were referencing the Margrave of Meissen. The intervention of Ottokar is seen as decisive in terms of putting down the last great Prussian uprising up until the 1270s, which seals the fate essentially for the Prussian pagan population forever. A little bit of historical irony I'll note in terms of what I can contribute to this discussion. If Ottokar is
Yeah.
seen as the savior of German Prussia, and Ottokar is the namesake given to the foundation of the city of Königsberg, which will later be a Prussian capital, Ottokar was defeated and killed at the Battle of Marchfeld by the Habsburg Emperor, or would-be Emperor, the King of the Romans, Rudolf I. So the founder of Königsberg was killed by a Habsburg, and later will be the Prussians who defeat the Habsburgs to become emperors of Germany. Just a weird little note of historical irony, I thought. But
Mm,
uh, yes, it's pretty much just to further illustrate the notion that the Teutonic Order, as a sort of almost in terms of looking at it as any sort of other European comparison with the Hospitallers and the Teutonic Order, it is becoming a European behemoth by the time of the 1250s. They're able to fight off the competing land grants that we see from the Masovian or the Polish dukes in general, or even the attempt to establish Dacian, i.e., episcopal structures and uh, ultimate sovereignty over these territories, instead aligning with the Pope. And of course, you mentioned the conflict between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, between Frederick II, who dies in 1250, and his successor Conrad, um, Manfred, and ultimately Conradin, as these conflicts again work out to the fundamental detriment and the destruction of the House of Hohenstaufen. The papacy is the one who claims ultimate sort of sovereignty over these territories, but is effectively for naught because as the papacy will diminish in the latter half of the 13th century, there is no effective oversight over these regions. And so the Teutonic Order are basically establishing a first. They're establishing a great monastic empire, which will primarily emerge in the 14th century to be a menace to other Catholic nations.
yes, and it would be rivals, particularly to, as you mean, Königsberg, Riga, the relationship between Lubeck and then, of course, the Hanseatic League going forward. And also it is worth noting because you've streamed about this before, AM. Um, when you have the dissolutions of the Templar Knights in the way that it happened, the Prussian order and the um, Teutonic state were become quite more cautious when it comes to outside help, so to speak, and you see that in because within the next what the map you see on the right there, that's 1260. You have these constant uprisings. The last big one, I believe, was in 1347. They're more in Livonia than anywhere else. It was the St George uprisings, and it resulted. Um, I mean, you had the final um, grey zone you see of like the more sort of isolated Prussian tribes falling under Teutonic rule, but also the isolation of Lithuania as the last, and you see on the map there, they are surrounded by uh, the Orthodox Russians in the east and the German and Polish Catholics in the west and Scandinavians in the north. But of course, the Lithuania then would burst out into the scenes and go on to govern a pretty huge medieval state,
Well,
made up.
the largest state in Europe, or
Yeah,
for a
at its
brief
yeah.
amount of time.
I think stretching down, from where the position now all the way down to uh, Kiev and the I was going to say
Well, even further
Black
south,
Sea, yeah,
beyond Zaporizhia to the Black Sea, where modern
yeah,
day Odessa used to be Ogachow, stands. So the irony being again that the Teutonic Order are making these incremental and ultimately ephemeral gains against the Lithuanians. The Lithuanians, meanwhile, are making these grandiose conquests at the expense of the former Rus principalities, which have been decimated by the Mongols. And it'll be the Lithuanians converting or on their own volition as opposed to being conquered, which causes a bit of
yeah,
an existential crisis for the Teutonic Order going forward. So the great gains the Teutonic Order make once this region has basically been, sundered of its notable pagan population is to go after Poland and take over the city of Danzig, which by extension further enhances the power of the Hanseatic League and the German merchants throughout the
mm,
Vistula. So it suits basically the needs of all parties for
yeah,
the Germans to be in control of that region.
yeah. And in 1398, they also engage in operations in Gotland to root out piracy as well. Um, which again, the sort of the last. I mean, I think the last, the last hoorah for the Teutonic, or it was the Battle of Gernwald in 1410. I think is it 1410?
Battle
Um,
of Grunwald, yes,
yeah,
also
yeah,
known as the Battle of Tannenberg, which is why the Battle of Tannenberg that take place in World War I was called such because it had to be a dramatic historical reversal of a Slavic victory against Germans. Now it was a German victory against
yeah,
Slavs. So quite an iconic battle and part of Polish national legend, where
yeah,
the Grand Master and much of the strength of the Teutonic Order was not decimated, but their potential to expand and hold on to Pomerania, the region which would later become Royal Prussia of the Polish crown, was seriously diminished.
yeah. And also, I mean, I'll probably talk about it in another stream, but there's also the legacy of the Teutonic invasion into Novgorod and the legacy that comes from that from the Russian point of view as well.
Well, I mean, a lot of people have even claimed that it's of such dubious veracity that whatever sort of raids and incursions were actually made have basically become immortalized in propaganda more so than historical
yeah,
records. So that's another interesting angle you can take it.
yeah. I mean, it seems like that they were maybe building illegal for like forts outside of territory as like a, but yeah, I mean, just to round it all up, that there would be this consistent back and forth, from throughout the century of Prussian uprisings, and as you can see, you see on the map on the red there in Prussia, this is the red dots are the areas of uprisings, and it would, on first two occasions, it would in some it nearly get to the point where the orders could be overrun and forced out, and it would be through like King Ottocar of Bohemia sort of coming to the rescue here, just overwhelming force. But also the Prussians, of course, you can see like their fortifications. They were able to build these great castles and forts, which would then go on to serve as the domineer over the region, as well as the trade cities and the merchants that would come on to the scene, which then would, you know, uh, you would see like like Sventopol, for example, feeling that this was the Teutonic Order's, betrayal, would ally with pagan Prussians in this revolt. And this is where you start to see the Polish, the Western Slavic populations actually treating the Germanic Teutonic state here as a hostile power on par with the old
But again, we
Prussians.
have to, in terms of contextualizing this, we have to first and foremost look at it as a dispute over medieval fiefdoms and territories before we look at it as primarily an ethnic conflict, because that is very much post hoc. When we look at Culm law, Chelmno law, for example, there were a significant number of Germans in Poland, not in the areas held by the Teutonic Order or even areas like Danzig, but in Krakow, in Mazovia, in Lublin, Malpolska, the area in the south, there by the invitation and the grant of the king, because there was basically mutual advantage in having Germans with their mercantile and artisanal skills to bring and help make the kingdom more prosperous, in the same way that there were a significant number of quote unquote Saxons in the kingdom of Hungary. And these had a vertical relationship of being subjects to their king. So, whilst we have a preponderance of Germans in the newly colonized Teutonic Order by the beginning of the 14th century, considering the Prussians who have also been assimilated, there is a large German contingent which also exists in Poland. So the whole sort of Polish national perspective again would make it even more complicated when you consider how many Germans, increasing numbers of Germans, would find themselves as part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth for the next few centuries.
Mm, yeah, and of course I also I do think though that the
And it should be mentioned that when Frederick II reverses the eras of Poland's gains and actually begins to unite the territory which had once been held by the Teutonic Order, by connecting Prussia for the first time with the rest of Germany, he wasn't doing so with the intent of re-Germanizing these regions. He was doing so for the sake of cutting off Polish trade through the Vistula and making Poland into an economic dependency of Prussia.
mm, I I think also the role of this monastic state in its origins, it was very much viewed as you're going to be effectively obviously servicing the church, but also serving the local, Duke of Masovia and the various Polish principalities. And of course, though being the being chartered and everything with the hero and emperor, it comes down to who holds that ultimate authority for the order and their activities. Who are they beholden to, if anyone,
And I
apart from
think
the church and the secular?
the consensus I think we've established is that they weren't beholden to anyone, because of the bizarre situation in which they were
Mm,
basically invited as a result of a failed Polish Mazovian attempt to push them out of the Kurmaland. And there
Yeah,
was a competition between the emperor and the papacy, Honorius and Frederick to be specific, to grant the order and the nascent bishoprics rights over these territories. And by the time we get to the end of the 14th century, the Teutonic Order have well and utterly superseded all of those original claims, and all the powers they basically claim to represent are basically fragmented or inert. So, in that situation, it's remarkable that the Teutonic Order, I mean, to put this in perspective, the Teutonic Order is holding on to those territories you can see on the right hand map, whilst the Templars is having all of their territories and their entire reputation dismantled. So it is quite breathtaking, placed in a
yeah,
relative context of Europe at that time.
yeah, and it's interesting. That's that's something that is quite interesting. That as you mentioned, the hospitals had roads. Not not St. John had Malta, but on not on this sort of scale. And of course, Templars never had this, and of course they would end up, you know, with the king of with Philip of France. Um, but I mean, yeah, just I think
But
on
in
that
terms of
summary,
also confirming the irony further, I mean, you and I are both sort of saying that this is a matter for the church. Um, then we add the other notion that all of these areas would, by and large, go over to the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century.
yeah,
It is the German areas which were held by the Livonian and the Prussian orders, the Teutonic Knights, that go over almost uniformly to become Protestants, while it's the areas under Poland and Lithuania that remain steadfastly Catholic. So even
particularly
the so in the end, the church, even the church legacy doesn't exist. All we have is the German element.
but particularly the last pagan holdout of um, the what is it um, um, in Lamata, where they're believed to be a pagan holdout as late as 14, 15, 14, 20, on a very small local level, not on an official level. Um, Even by then, when you had the the Reformation, this was the being a sort of role of reverse of you had the Protestant heresy, and then suddenly the previous pagan um, holdout regions then become the holdout regions for Catholicism. So yeah,
And there's a bit of counter reverse social engineering when the Protestants provide the Prussians a catechism and a Bible in their own language. So a lot of the Protestant Reformation is actually appealing to a sense of nativism, whether it be the
yeah,
Welsh in England or whether it be the Prussian population in the Baltic. They're always attempting to present the Protestant Reformation as a reification of a conquered and subjugated culture. If anything, again, that made the integration of the conquered Prussian population into the Lutheran Reformation all the easier.
no, no, absolutely. I mean, on that, thank you, AM, for joining us tonight. We've gone over just over 2 hours now, so we will wrap up. Do you have anything you want to promote before we head off, AM?
Uh, I guess if you're interested in this sort of history, I've done a stream a few weeks ago on the disillusion of the Knights Templars, which is stands in complete sort of contrast to this. But other than that, obviously, you've been going into this with a lot of very sort of granular detail, and all I can do is provide some sort of broad strokes questions or whatever. But thank you for having me on, and it's been very interesting to sit here and learn.
No, no, thank you, and it was really good to have your insight and sort of like the debate of I mean, like particularly the one with the the nature of the populations and why they struggled compared to other European ones with Christianity. I mean, that's something that I've asked myself for years, and I've seen a few German and Polish and historians talk about it as well, and different theories. But no, absolutely, thank you. And um, yeah, I will. I'll thank everyone in chat as well. Sorry, I haven't interacted with chat. It's just we wanted to focus on this one today. We will continue with our Crusade series going forward, um, and uh, we'll go on from there. So, apart from that, everyone, thank you. I'll link AM's channel in the description below. But until then, thank you all, and have a good night.